All right. Okay, the line should be muted to all except those who should be presenting. Today we're going to hear from Dustin Bankson, Deputy Operations Project Manager for the Willamette Valley Project, and Selena Hart, the Chief Reservoir Regulation and Water Quality Section. They will cover current conditions, forecast, and overall outlook. Again, we are recording this meeting, and Dustin, if you're ready, just let me know when you would like to move ahead as far as slides.
Thanks, Tom. Hey, and I appreciate everybody being here today, taking a little bit of time out of their lunch for this update. While I don't think that what we're going to present today is going to be, new information to a lot of folks. Most of you are seeing what we're experiencing out on the ground. And I think many of you were probably at a prior briefing for us. We did want to get back out and kind of update on where we are and some of the forecast projections for the remainder of the summer. I've been in the Willamette Valley for 28 years. I know most of you have been around for a long time, and this is certainly in many ways an unprecedented year for us in terms of conservation storage and water management. And, as we worked through this season, really had limited decisions that we could make given what happened. And Selena will talk about that a little bit. As soon as we as we get closer to fall, we may have some more challenges ahead of us, but I think where we are sitting right now is certainly unique in a lot of our experiences, and so we'll continue to bring this kind of information out on a regular basis as we move through the remainder of the year, so that folks know what to expect and plan for. You can see where we're sitting system-wide right now. I think most of you are familiar with the teacup diagram. If you're not, I think at the end of the slideshow we've got that address. It is one of the best sources of information for folks to stay up to speed on water levels in the valley and how that affects access, flows downstream, et cetera. Tom, next slide. So we'll talk today just about our current priorities in this environment. I will touch just very briefly on the entire system as an overview. I always want to take into account that we have some new people attending. They may not understand how we operate as a system. And then Selena will talk some specifics about SNOWPACK and precipitation over the course of this year, our forecast leading out into the fall, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Tom, next slide. So I think many of you know, but the Willamette Valley Project, as we define it, consists of a set of multi-purpose dams, 13 dams spread throughout the valley, all a little bit different in terms of design and exactly how they're operated. Some produce power. 8 of our facilities are power-producing facilities. And when we talk about multi-purpose projects, we really talk about flood risk management as a primary purpose, and then how we use stored water at this time of the year for hydropower, for water supply, for water quality benefits, for recreation in the pool, all of those multi-purposes being important to us and trying to work to find a balance and get as much benefit as we can out of whatever water we have to work with over the course of the year. Next slide, Tom. I think the thing that sometimes gets lost in that discussion, though, is that the Willamette Project also includes other assets, mitigation fish hatcheries as part of the original construction. So, we understood at the time dams were being built that there was going to be impact to habitat above those dams, and the mitigation strategy at that time was to create fish hatcheries. A navigation channel that at least exists in authorization. Some of you remember Willamette Falls locks. Or have been to Willamette Falls locks. And then we have hundreds of miles of bank protection designed at the time to kind of keep the river constrained and minimize impacts to infrastructure and primarily agriculture in the system. Tom? So again, touching on those authorized purposes, and I think, whenever we have discussions about conservation storage and what can be done in the future, and I know that may be a part of the conversation here. Keep in mind that flood risk management is a primary driver for us, right? Life safety, interests downstream of our dams. Many of us will remember what happened in April of 2019. And, in a 7-day span, going from trying to fill our pools leading into the end of conservation season to fighting a flood of kind of historic proportions itself, given the time of year. And we prevented almost $2 billion of flood damages in the Willamette Valley in a 7-day span. So as a primary driver in the background, you know, is always that life safety piece and protection of what exists downstream. But, you know, as we store water, as we, you know, see what we have to work with in our total storage capacity, we try to maximize benefits, you know, across that range of purposes: hydropower, navigation, our water quality mission that I mentioned. Water that we have stored in the reservoirs, some of it is available for contract, under contract to the Bureau of Reclamation for irrigation. Certainly, as the population in the Willamette Valley grows, there's an increasing interest in water supply for municipal and industrial purposes. And then many of you, just looking at who's on the roster, especially at this time of the year, benefit from recreation that we have on those pools, and that's an enormous economic impact to local communities, as well as our environmental stewardship mission for the lands that we manage around the project. Next slide, Tom. So yeah, current conditions right now. You know, we have real challenges, had real challenges this year. We made some decisions early on in the year and worked through with our partners ways of conserving water, but a very unique year for us. You know, we started off in January, and as Selena will show, with normal conditions, a pretty robust snowpack. And then in many, many ways, we just didn't see water over that critical refill period and really didn't see any water going into the spring. And I think one piece that we want to clarify is that, you know, it really was those conditions that have affected us. Earlier in the year, we had some pool restrictions due to dam safety at Detroit go into place. We had some pool restrictions at Hills Creek and Lookout Point. But the conditions on the ground, right, the water we had to work with this year, those restrictions didn't come into play. They really didn't affect what we had in terms of system-wide storage. We just never got the water. We never saw a real pressure at those elevations that it would have affected our total conservation storage. So I want to dispel something that I think is still a bit confusing for folks out there. While these restrictions will remain into effect next season, and they could affect our operations, they really didn't come into play for us this year. So with that, I'm going to transition, I think, in the next slide to Selena, and she'll just talk about how the conservation season played out and then what we can expect through the remainder of the year. Next slide, Tom. Oh, I'm sorry. I was too early. Priorities for us. So, and they continue to be. You know, for us, we're going to continue the work that we do to operate and maintain the facilities safely in a secure way, working through, I think many of you have been, at least on the periphery of our update to our environmental impact statement in the Willamette Valley, and expect that sometime in the next couple of months we'll be coming out for an update on that as well. You know, we're still working very hard on wildfire recovery work in anticipation of flood season. A lot of cleanup work around our projects and planning for a winter season in the North Santiam and in the McKenzie Basin, where the hydrology has been altered significantly. With these lower pool levels come some other risks to natural resources, and our stewardship responsibilities kick in protecting cultural resources that may be exposed differently than they have been in the past. And then I think most of you, and this is the hardest part, you know, this year, we have had 3 fatalities within the Willamette Valley, water-related fatalities. And while I don't think any of them were necessarily related to low water levels, that risk is certainly out there as the pools get smaller. Different hazards than folks are used to seeing at this time of the year start to pop up out there. And so we're going to be ramping up our water safety message and our communication through staff out in the field, as I think many of your organizations are probably doing the same. So hoping to turn the rest of this year into more of a success story in that regard than we've had so far. And with that, Selena, I think transition to you.
Thanks, Dustin. All right, so Yeah, talking about the hydrology. So on the left-hand side, it shows our water year precipitation. So our water year starts on October 1st, but the projects actually start refill on February 1st. So we really look at that time of year for our refill. And in February, we got quite a bit of precipitation. It wasn't so bad. You know, we were above average, or at least near average in most of the basin. But really, that's when we got all that snow accumulation. And here in Portland, I got a nice ice storm, lost power. It was a pretty big storm. So, you know, we did build that snowpack, which was really great. But then March came along, and we were dry. I mean, we were below 50% of average. And then April came, and May came, and it's just been so dry. And that's how we refill these projects, is that precipitation in those months. Continue. And so just looking at the rest of that, or the full refill period on the top, and, you know, the Willamette Basin is the left-hand side of the larger Columbia Basin. So it's just the whole area there that's just been red, which means below 50% of normal. And it's June, looks like, you know, we got a little bit more on the coastal area, but still is really dry. And then we compared this year, or any dry years, to 2015, because that was our big drought that we hadn't seen anything since about 2001. And the fact that we had something so recent, and then now, you know, 2020, oh, sorry, this should be 2021 at the top. 2021's been so dry, it's just, it's not even comparable anymore to 2015, because 2015, you can see we had some precipitation, a little bit more precipitation than we had this year. Next slide. So like I said, in February, we did build that good snowpack, and you can see on the graphic on the right-hand side, you can see how it just started building, and then in April, it peaked and then started to melt. And that snowpack is another thing that helps us. It doesn't necessarily help us on the refill, but it helps us at the end of the refill season, and really helps us prolong our summer season and keep those inflows into the project happening. And as you see, the snow melted fairly fast as we started getting those warming temperatures, and by the end of June, that water was completely gone. We melted all of our snow, and so we're just getting little trickles of inflows to our projects now. Next slide. And then looking at the drought, you know, our entire state is in some sort of drought, and the Willamette Valley is definitely in that drought condition as well. So, you know, we're looking at a significant drought across the entire state, and that's just what we're dealing with this year. Next slide. And since we've had really dry conditions and warming temperatures, and the short-term outlook is continuing to be that way. I mean, it's Oregon. We tend to have, you know, slightly warmer temperatures and not a lot of precipitation this time. So it says above normal temperatures. We've been feeling that. And then the equal chance of going precipitation just means, you know, we don't get a lot of precipitation. So I'm not going to expect to see much more of this summer. Anything that we do get will just be a benefit, but it's looking to be continuously dry going into fall. And like Justin said, that's the concern. You know, we're releasing our water right now, and we start to draft much lower into our reservoirs, starts to get impacted. Next slide. All right, so I'll go into what our forecast is. Just a little background. Like Dustin said, we work with our partners to make our decisions. We do a lot of adaptive management on our flow decisions, and our flows are really dictated by the House document 531, which is our authorizing document for these Willamette projects, and then the 2008 biological opinion. So that's a requirement. It says how we shall release water and for the benefits of ESA listed species. So we have minimum flows that we're trying to adhere to, and different parts of the year will have different flow requirements, and then different water years different hydrologic conditions will drive different operations. So this year being that we're in a drought, we consider this a deficit water year, and we're managing flows slightly differently because of that. And we also identified really early on that this was going to be a dry year. And so that coordination with our partners started way back in March as we were talking about how we were going to strategize for this type of year. And we did make some adjustments early on. Typically, we have a minimum flow that we need to meet down on the main stem Willamette, down at SALEM, and then also at Albany. And we worked with our partners to adjust those flows and prioritize tributary releases, which was a lot less water than what we would have had to if we would have released water for the main stem. So we conserved a significant amount of water this year because of that coordination with the agencies, our partner agencies. We did do a couple operations where we did some pulsing of water. So it was kind of a trade-off of how we want to use that water. We wanted to use that water, the amount of water that we had in our reservoirs to meet downstream flows or meet downstream needs for the fish. We wanted to use that water the most impactful way, which when we had that big heat wave at the end of June that we were all experiencing, we actually increased our outflows from a few of the projects to increase the flows on the main stem, which reduced the main stem temperatures by about 5 degrees, which was provided cooler temperatures for the fish, which normally would have been more potentially lethal. And so we, used that water instead of using it early on when it wasn't as beneficial. We chose to use a smaller amount of water with a very targeted purpose. And so that kind of adaptive management is the things that we do to try to conserve the water for all the purposes that we have. And you can see, I'll show you in the graph some of those benefits that we want to be able to achieve. Additionally, we did do some adjustments on the north and south Fanny Ann's to improve refill. So we had biological opinion flows that we reduced. Normally we're releasing about 1,500 CFS, and we, I think, reduced down to like 1,200 or 1,100. So we were able to conserve quite a bit of water there, which improved the refill of both those projects. So there are things that we did do this year to improve that refill and extend our summer season that happens behind the scenes. I'll go through all those different all the projects and what we're forecasting to do. One of the things, because the water supply is very low, we are looking to likely drop below our normal minimum pool levels at a couple of the projects so that we can use a little bit more storage to support the ESA listed species. So some of these graphs will show the reservoir drafting below that minimum pool, and as Dustin said, there's things that we have to do when the reservoirs get that low, and there's a lot more potential safety issues within the reservoir itself. Okay, next slide. All right, Tom, you might want to maybe use some pointers on here, but this is just a graphic of this year's operations and the 2015, just for comparison. So this is looking at the system storage of the Willamette Basin, so our 11 storage projects that we have in the basin. And the black line is the rule curve, so that is what we are authorized to manage to. Below that line is our conservation storage, and then above is our flood risk management storage. So we operate to or below that line unless we're managing for a flood. As you can see, like in the winter, the reservoir bumps up above the roll curve because we're actively engaged in a flood risk management operation. And then, so the purple line that's not fully completed is this year's water year, and then the red line is the 2015 water year. And we keep saying this is a really bad year. I've mentioned it's actually worse than 2015, but you look at this graph and you're like, well, why are we higher than 2015? That's that adaptive management, that we were able to release a lot less water during that refill so that we were actually able to store a lot more, even though the inflows to the reservoirs are just as bad or worse off in 2015, but because we were able to not release as much, we were able to refill better. Those lines on the bottom are the inflow and outflow for the system. So the blue line, I'm missing the outflow title blocks, but the inflow is the blue line and the outflow is the green line. So as you can see at the very beginning of the graphic, we've got these some spikes of inflow, and you can see where we release less water than what was coming in, which means that we will then store that water. And if the if the outflow is greater than inflow, that means we're going to be drafting the reservoir. So we had decent precipitation in February, which is when we were having all those storms. A lot of that came in as snow, and we did have inflow to the lower basin project. So we were able to refill quite a bit, and then the inflows just started receding pretty early on, and you can see we were releasing lower than what was coming in, so we were storing. And then we got to a point where we were releasing the lowest that we possibly could, and that's where we're kind of at right now. So you can see starting in April, we've been really low, been holding that pretty much the whole time. You can see the couple pulses in June. Those are the pulses that we were doing for the temperature operation. Other than that, we've been releasing just the minimums from the projects to meet the minimum tributary flows that are noted in the biological opinion. So we've been releasing the minimums that we can possibly release this season, and this is where we're at. This has just been a really difficult water year. Okay, next slide. All right, so we'll get into the nitty-gritty. All right, so I mentioned that we have flow targets on the main stem at Albany and Salem that we had to essentially forego this year and just focus on the tributaries. And then that water that we release from the tributaries does accumulate down on the main stem. And so this is what we wound up managing to, which was lower than what is in the biological opinion. Currently, for a deficit year, we're trying to target about 5,000 CFS at Salem. We are slightly above that rate. I'm getting feedback from someone.
There, put this in there. Don't need that.
We're releasing just enough to we're actually seeing flows meet the deficit year flows at Salem, but as the natural recession of the unregulated basins start to recede, we'll start seeing Salem continue to, or the flows on the main stem continue to get a little bit lower. And I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty on these forecasts, but we're looking at maybe seeing some record lows on the main stem, possibly pre-dam. We're releasing more than what's coming into the project, so that is something, that is a good thing that the dams are able to provide and supplement the main stem quite a bit because of the releases that they are able to provide. But we're still likely to see some pretty low flows. And with that, there is, the impact to the boat traffic with that lower flow and more impact, various debris and stuff. So I just want to make sure people are aware that not only the reservoirs are going to be low, but the river is likely to be very low as well. Next slide. All right, so starting at the Middle Fork, Hills Creek at the very top. I'll just give you a little orientation of what this graphic is, and then each project I have the same setup. So the upper left-hand corner where Tom's cursor is looking at we call it the stack graph. So it's looking at the last few water years, so we can see where we are in relation to previous years. So you can see we're pretty low, minus a couple operations that we had to do, but we're much lower than the last few years. And then the right-hand side is the forecast graphic. Apologies. The left-hand side is the for elevation, and the bottom is the date on both those graphics. And on this graphic, you can see the vertical line that states the time of the model run. So anything to the left-hand side was the actuals, and anything to the right is our forecast. And then we noted what the elevation is expected based on this forecast for Labor Day. And then we have identified what the boat ramp elevations, and which ones are going to be still available on Labor Day. So if it's highlighted or bolded, like Packard here, elevation 1441, that boat ramp will be available during Labor Day at Hills Creek. But the other boat ramps are at a higher elevation, and we've drafted below those, and so they're no longer accessible. Okay, so that's Hills Creek, and this is that's one of the reservoirs that it does look like we're likely to have to draft further into below minimum conservation pool. So we'll be monitoring that. Thanks, Tom. Next slide. All right, and then Lookout Point is downstream of Hills Creek on the same tributary. So all the water that we release from Hills Creek then fills up into Lookout Point. You can see Lookout Point, we're kind of in the middle of the last few years of operations. Lookout Point is a project that we use heavily to support those main stem flows. So the fact that we didn't have those releases did conserve a lot of water at Lookout Point. Otherwise, I would see that we would likely be much lower, as shown in the 2015, the bluish green color. So that's about how much water we conserve this year by adjusting our operations, that we would see something much lower like 2015. And then looks like we will be reaching elevation 856.9 on Labor Day. So we have the Signal Point elevation, or Signal Point boat ramp still available at that time. All right. Next slide. And then Fall Creek, which discharges into the Middle Fork downstream of Lookout Point, but on a different tributary. Fall Creek, we're kind of in line with the 2015 flows right now. We've been releasing just minimums this entire time, supporting the adult fish collection facility there. And then you can see we have a deep drawdown that we normally do, so we'll be just holding our flows right now until we get to our roll curve, as you can see on the right-hand graph. It shows that we'll get to elevation 779.4 on Labor Day with the North Shore boat ramps available. And then it shows that we'll get to our roll curve at the end of October timeframe, and then we'll do that deep drawdown that we normally do each year. Next slide. And then Cottage Grove, this has been a really hard year for Cottage Grove and DORENA. We've been releasing minimums since the beginning, and we were slightly above roll curve for a short duration because of some decent inflows, and it drafted pretty quickly. Very small basin, or very small reservoir. So it looks like, based on the forecast, we'll be drafting down to minimum conservation pool just by releasing minimums at the same time that we normally would be for flood control operations. So it looks like we'll be at 759.7 feet on Labor Day, and the lakeside boat ramp will still be available for access to the reservoir. Next slide. And then DORENA, similar story, just been, we were a little bit above, and then just got really dry. So we're predicting that we'll be at elevation 794.7 on Labor Day. The Bakers Bay boat ramp should still be available, and we'll just be drafting until we hit roll curve. And it looks like we'll have a little bit of storage that we'll have to evacuate to get down to our flood risk management mission elevation, but we're just planning on continuing to release the minimums at those projects. Fern Ridge. Fern Ridge is another one that we were a little bit higher on the above for the first part of the February during refill. We reduced our minimums from 50 CFS to 30 CFS, and we still wound up pulling away from the roll curve at late February and early March, and they continued to just barely fill, and then they started receding pretty quickly. So we're projecting to be at elevation 366.8 on Labor Day. That does give, this one's a tough one. Our forecast it's a forecast. There's a lot of uncertainty. We do show that we will have a couple boat ramps available, but that's kind of pushing it pretty close to the forecast. So definitely be looking out at our teacup page and look at reservoir elevations before you go out to these projects. The forecast will change based on actual. So this one, there's a lot of uncertainty with what's going to be available on Labor Day. Next slide. All right, going over to the McKenzie Basin, Cougar Reservoir. We're kind of in the middle of our normal operation, our normal elevations that we've had. Cougar is another reservoir that we have typically used quite a bit for main stem augmentation. So we were able to keep that project fuller longer than we normally would have. It does show that we'll be near 1585.9 feet on Labor Day. Cougar is one of the reservoirs that we don't have very many boat ramps. So we don't have anything at the lower elevation, unfortunately. So we don't show any boat ramps available. Next slide. And then Blue River, another project we do use heavily for the main stem augmentation, so we were able to conserve a little bit more water. It also doesn't have a lot for boat ramps, so I skipped over the left-hand side. Yeah, we did use Blue River. You can see these big drops in the reservoir early on. Those were because Blue River was used heavily for the main stem temperature operation. So that's the pulses of water that we released to cool down the temperatures during that big heat wave, which was very successful, but it does take a toll on the reservoir storage. However, we do normally use Blue River to support main stem augmentation, and so we did conserve that water early on in the year. So it's just a trade-off of instead of using it early on and not allowing the project to refill, we used it later on and it drafted the project. And we do plan on picking up some flows in the next couple weeks to support the main stem. As I said, main stem's likely to be pretty low, so we're going to try to augment with that little bit of storage that we have. So we'll likely see Blue River starting to pick up. So there's a little bit of uncertainty here. We might draft this a little bit harder, but it's likely to be drafting at a pretty steep rate. Try to hold off as much as we can till Labor Day, but there's some uncertainty in how we're going to manage to support the main stem as the main stem does start to recede. So keep an eye on Blue River, but right now it does show that we'll be at 1244.4, but we don't have any boat ramps that will be available at that lower elevation. Okay, next slide. Green Peter. We did, reduce our outflows to help support its refill. So we were refilling right along the roll curve for most of the time. And then April came and we just stopped getting the inflows, and we were having to, we released our minimums for the tributary, for tributaries for the fish, and we started starting to see the project recede, and we'll continue to see the project recede. Green Peter is we heavily regulate to support fish in that basin. So it's this water is being used to support the fish, and we'll likely draft below minimum conservation pool. As you can see here, minimum conservation pool being at 921, I believe. Yeah, thank you, Tom. And so you can see it's drafting pretty far down there. At these projects, I mentioned that Hills Creek about drafting. So Hills Creek and Green Peter both have power pools. So the low minimum conservation pool is a storage that is supposed to be used for power production. So if we do have a dry season and we draft a low minimum, so there is the ability to still generate and produce power. So that's what that means when we draft a low minimum conservation pool. And then if you don't have power, it just means you're drafting lower than you normally are supposed to, you normally operate to. And there's just, more cultural things that we have to manage for. And then, there's minimums for being able to pass flow through gates and stuff that are much lower in elevation. So we're not looking at anything concerning like that. So yeah, green peter will show we're likely to draft below into the power pool to support fish operations later on through the year. And it does look like we'll have the Thistle Creek or the Thistle boat ramp available during Labor Day. And then Foster is the one reservoir that we do fill full pretty much every year because it is the hybrid project. Is not only does flood control operations, but it also is a re-regulation dam. So we use this to smooth flows downstream of Green Peter. So we fill this reservoir, and then it has a daily fluctuation based on the releases we have from Green Peter. So you can see the daily fluctuations, or it's pretty full, but isn't always completely at the top. So we did fill Foster as we do most years. The forecast, because we are seeing the dry conditions and the storage in this basin is so important for the fish, we are likely to start drafting Foster slightly earlier than we historically have. I've been explaining this, I think, for the last meetings we've had with our internal folks. So hopefully this information is getting out that we'll likely start drafting right after Labor Day. So that is a change from what we normally do. And that's just because we're just looking for more storage to support downstream flow conditions. And since we do typically keep the reservoir full through Labor Day, we should have all boat ramps available during that weekend. All right, next slide. And then Detroit, we did adjust our flows to provide as much increased refill as we could. So we got up a little bit. We were shy of full refill, but we were definitely better than the 2015 operation. As you can see, that bluish green line on the left-hand spot. We're looking to, we're continuing to just release the minimums for the tributary, and we're likely to see about 15, 16 elevation on Labor Day. Mongold boat ramp, lower boat ramp at elevation 1450 is available. I don't see any reason that it won't be available through the conservation season and into flood season at this point. So we do still have that boat ramp available at Detroit. Okay, next slide. All right.
Yeah, so, excuse me, I coughed beforehand. So, as you can see, this is just a unique water year. While every water year is a bit unique, without that rain in the spring, our ability to refill is compromised. I think one of the things that we didn't necessarily explain early on, though, and Selena did a nice job of hitting, is really taking what we learned in 2015, right, the coordination internally with our water management partners in 2015, helped us conserve water this year, and in a year where precipitation was significantly less than what we've experienced there, we have better reservoir conditions overall and some options for late in the season as we try to manage through until we start to see some rains come this winter. So, there is far more adaptive management, I think, at times than folks are aware of in the system. It wasn't going to be enough this year to significantly improve conditions from a recreation standpoint, or really at any given reservoir change the tide for us at the early part of the season. So you know, we've seen in past peak elevations for the reservoir season this year, and trying to project out as best we can so folks can plan for what remains of the water year. We'll be continuing to monitor and work with our partners to understand implications on the main stem, and we may have to pull water out to manage impacts below our reservoirs this fall. But we'll continue that coordination and communication both with the managing agencies and with you all as we get into the fall and we see how things evolve. Expect to see us talking more and more about safety at our projects, something I mentioned earlier, and I forgot a piece of that. You know, anytime we get to lower than normal levels in our reservoirs, there are folks that are curious, right? You want to get out and see these things. And there are hazards out there that folks could be exposed to. You know, we have unconsolidated soils, and the risk of engulfment is real. And so you'll see public information around safety going out. We really want to keep folks out of those areas in the reservoirs because of that hazard and that risk. So we had similar messages out in 2015. You'll see us coming out with those again, but to the extent that you can help us keep folks from getting out in there, it's attractive from a curiosity standpoint, but there are risks out there that folks could be exposed to that really we can't identify easily. So we want to keep folks out, keep them safe this remainder of the year. And with that, Tom, I think we have about 15 minutes left for questions. Thanks for popping up that information on where you can go for updated information on river levels. I mentioned the teacup diagram earlier. I'm looking in the chat, not seeing anything there, but I'll just pause and see if we have questions from the group.
And we did have those questions we received yesterday. I don't know if those are ones that you remember, or I can bring them up if you would like.
Sure, Tom.
I don't know if they're on, I don't know if those folks are on the call specifically, but it could just be something we can address overall.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I take the gray area out of it. I think the natural question is, well, what are we doing about these kinds of conditions going into the future? And it's a challenge because this is such a unique year, such a difficult year. You can look back at some of the graphs that Selena had in 2016 and 2017. We had very abundant years, and then we've had some of these extreme both snow and rainfall events that have caused some late season flooding. Where I would point people to is, as we work through the update to our environmental impact statement and we look at alternatives to operations, that would be a place, and we will have a lot of public information going out about how folks can connect to that, where I think you'll be able to get more refined information on how we might operate the projects differently in the future over the range. And there are a lot of demands on the system right now. Some have always been there, but a lot of new demands on the system, and that's probably the best place for us to try to refine alternatives to the way we've operated over the last 50, 60, 70 years.
Okay. So again, no questions in the chat yet. So if you're on and have a question, please pop it in there. I would say we can probably try to, if there are people on the phone who have questions to ask, we'll just try and be patient with how that can be, in the sense of having people talk over one another. So what I might try and do is just ask a couple numbers that I can see if they have any questions, and if that's your number, then you can come off of mute and maybe ask a question. And we do see one question that came in too, and so we can potentially address that in a minute. Let me get to some of these phone to see if anybody has that. I know we have Amanda on that. She might be able to provide us an answer for that other question as well. But there's a phone number, a 503 number here, with the last two numbers being 58. If you have a question, you can come off of mute. See how all this works. All right. I'll do one more, and then we can go to the chat because there's another question in there. Phone number, the 541 number with the last numbers being 23. If you have a question, you can come off of mute and let us address something. Okay, so I'm not hearing anything from those two numbers. I think for the Fern Ridge question, that kind of goes to what Dustin was talking about earlier within the upcoming or the ongoing EIS based off of rule curve, I think is what your question is. So that might be able to be addressed more in the EIS that we have going on.
Yep. Yeah, Fern Ridge is a challenging one for us, and because it's the only basin that really comes out of the Coast Range, it's a little bit different. Challenge with Fern Ridge is it takes a long time to fill it up, and then when it fills up, it takes a long time to come back down with that constraint that we have downstream in terms of releases. And so there's a lot to consider in terms of refilling Fern Ridge earlier, and that would require some study and evaluation of modification to the rule curve. So I know that kind of question probably exists out there for every one of the dams, and so we look at that entire system-wide impact and some of those risks. But I'm trying to think back, Selena, 2006 would be 1 year. There have been a couple of others. Fern Ridge is a challenging one from a water management standpoint when we get up near the top end of that pool. In trying to manage flood risks downstream, and that's part of the difficulty on the long tom.
Okay, so Amanda Lyon, she just responded for the earlier question in the chat. So there's a lot to unpack in that as far as that decision. So you can see that in there. For the question from JT. I'll go and see if there's another number that is available for me to call on. I thought there was one other one in there. All right, I'm not seeing any of those two. So, we got another question in chat.
So I see a question in the chat from Courtney about temperature impacts fishing. And Courtney, I think you're referring to this, it's like a partial hoot owl restriction that limits in some basins folks fishing in the late afternoons. I don't really know that anything we've done or will do to this point will change that. I don't know if we have somebody from ODFW on that will look at it. Our temperature operations during that kind of the peak of the heat wave were pretty limited to that duration. And I'm looking at Selena as I say this. I don't know that we would end up in a similar situation. Can't say that we wouldn't, depending on what happens on the main stem. But that restriction to protect fish during this really unusual season and a set of unusual temperatures is something that ODFW would establish and continue to evaluate. That was a new one for me. That's the first time I've seen that.
Yeah, and I'll just say regarding our temperature operation, I mean, it's a balance between what happens on the tributary and what happens on the main stem. And so we were, talking with ODFW about that. And so we'll continue to work with our partners and make the right decisions to balance the water for the various fish and different species and different locations within the basin. It's definitely a complicated balancing act.
All right, I think if we get maybe one more question in there, if not, we can work on wrapping this up. As you can see, the number for the public affairs office is there, so you can always reach out to us and we can get questions to the appropriate staff members to address. Okay, so the from Dave White, the status of Detroit cooling and passage projects, so temperature control and downstream passage. So those are going to be included in the overall Willamette Valley EIS moving forward. So that's kind of the status right now. The earlier EIS for that is, again, that information is going to be wrapped up into the larger EIS for the Willamette Valley. So I don't know if I don't have a specific timeline for that.
Yeah, Dave. Hey, by the way, Dave, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a while. Haven't talked to you in a while. You know, for next year, you would expect to see us doing temperature operations similar to what we've done in the past, and as Amanda said earlier, evaluating you know, what's coming out of that court decision in terms of operations across the project. Something we can't really comment on at this point because some of those details are still being worked out. So probably more to come in the future as that happens, but hope to be able to connect with you soon. It's been a while since we've had a Detroit Lakes meeting.
All right, so thanks for everybody who listened in. Said I was recording this, so we'll post it later, and then we'll share via social media and probably some outreach through email. So thank you again, Selena and Dustin, and Amanda as well for participating in answering some questions. So I'm going to stop recording, and then I'll let people, I guess, filter out